To everyone who's tuning in with us today, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Ellen Bayard Weedon Lecture Series in the Arts of Asia. I'm Jordan Love, the Academic Curator at the Fralin Museum of Art. On behalf of the Fralin, we're delighted that you could join us for this special lecture. This series, which is underwritten by the Ellen Bayard Weedon Foundation, fosters an understanding of the rich artistic traditions of China, India, China, Japan, and all of Asia's regions and cultures. I'd like to extend my personal thanks to the Pollock family for their generous, longstanding support of this endeavor. Kavita Singh is professor of art history at the School of Arts and Aesthetics of Jawaharlal Nehru University, where she teaches courses in the history of Indian painting, particularly the Mughal and Rajput schools, and the history and politics of museums. Singh has published on secularism and religiosity, fraught national identities, and the memorialization of difficult histories as they relate to museums in South Asia and beyond. She has also published essays and monographs on aspects of Mughal and Rajput painting, particularly on style as a signifying system. In 2018, she was awarded the Infosys Prize in Humanities and was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2020. This illustrated talk, A New Museum for a New Nation, discusses the founding and early history of the National Museum of India at a time when the future of the institution is looking increasingly uncertain. Help me welcome Kavita Singh. Thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be invited to this very distinguished series at this very distinguished venue. And I'm really grateful to Dan Einbaum, who I know suggested me, and to everyone else at UVA and the Fralin Museum, who then extended this invitation. And I'm particularly grateful to Melissa Jordan Love for everything she's done to put this together, and to Rhonda Deck, who's working quietly behind the webcam, I know. So my gratitude to all, and my gratitude, of course, to everybody who's tuned in and has come to this talk. I hope there'll be something of interest for you here. So I live in New Delhi and I work on museums. And so it's inevitable that it would be a preoccupation for me to look at the biggest and most significant museum in my city, which is the National Museum of India. And I have returned to this topic several times. I've been interested in the moment of its birth, which happened just shortly after India became independent from colonialism. I've been interested in its early histories. And I've been particularly interested in the way this museum is entangled with both the ambitions and the dilemmas of a new nation. But everything that I have said or thought about the National Museum and its past history today is overshadowed by a very looming sense of the future, because I'm concerned about what might lie in store for the museum, as the building in which it is housed, which you see in this aerial shot on the left of the central vista, which is the main capital complex of New Delhi, and the National Museum is circled in yellow. So this building, along with many others, is slated to be demolished in a mammoth project to redevelop the central vista, and the architect's impression of what the redeveloped project will look like is given on the right, with, I think, a rather ambitious number of trees. I don't think there's going to be anywhere near that much greenery. I'm concerned about what happens to the museum. I'm concerned about what happens to the building. I'm concerned about what happens to the artifacts. But equally and more importantly, I think, I'm concerned about the histories that it relates, or it could potentially relate. Because all around us in India today, we are seeing histories being subjected to many different forms of correction or revision to bring the past in line with currently powerful ideologies. This slide shows just a smattering of very recent controversies as forces and groups that are allied with the powerful Hindu right-wing government are trying to prompt a rewriting of history and a recasting of various historical figures from India as either heroes or villains. So we don't know quite how this obsession with the rewriting of history is going to impact the museum when it reopens in a new site after this development. But I do have a very gloomy sense that in my studies of the National Museum, someday I will soon be able to complete the arc of my narrative of my study, and I'll be able to tell you the history of this museum from its beginning to its end. But let's go back to beginnings from now. And let me start by offering you a quotation from somebody who was observing the inauguration of a national museum in South Asia. Someone who is centrally involved in the proceedings recalls the event like this. He says, the formal opening of the National Museum was a successful function. The Governor General, flanked by his cabinet, made an imposing array on the platform. And in the body of the hall, an abundance of flowers and of the diplomatic corps concealed the scarcity of exhibits. Now, this is a sardonic observation at the inauguration of one particular national museum, but it can tell us a lot of things about national museums in general, because we can see that the opening of a national museum is an act of some political importance, because the Governor General and the entire cabinet and all the diplomats of the city have turned up for this event. And it's clearly much more important to be able to have this event, to have this kind of flourish, and to say that you have opened a museum by a certain target date than to actually have made preparations for all the things that a museum should have and should do. This museum is being very grandly inaugurated, even though it doesn't have a collection as yet. And so it makes us realize that the gesture of having made a national museum, of declaring that you have one, that you have opened it to the people, takes priority over actually making a national museum. You know, it takes priority over actually first assembling the collection, constructing a narrative, framing an exhibition, having curators, having docents already in action to present something through the National Museum. Now, some of you in the audience may have read essays that have been written about the National Museum of India, and you might be puzzled by this quote because it might be unfamiliar to you. And it's unfamiliar because it pertains not to the National Museum of India, but this is an observation that is made at the inauguration of the National Museum of Pakistan in 1950. And this happened just shortly after the inauguration of India's National Museum, whose story might be a little more familiar to this audience. But as you know, India and Pakistan were born out of a very difficult birth at the end of colonialism, where what was one territory was cleft very violently into two. And after this partition, as with every post-partition event in the cleft histories of our two nations, India and Pakistan, the origins, the stories, the fortunes of our two national museums are also very closely linked. Because when Pakistan actually announced in 1949, just 2 years after it became independent, that it would soon be inaugurating a national museum, that is what spurred the Indian government into hurrying up and making its own declaration that it would overtake Pakistan in this project. We have a much larger number of exhibits than the government of Pakistan, the Indian Secretary for Education is saying in this letter that I found in the archives. And it is a matter of some pride to us that our museum should open on a date not later than theirs. So there's this competition which spurs the two countries on, right? Now, in 1950, when Pakistan opened its National Museum to the public, it did so in a very provisional way. Not only did it not have much of a collection, but it didn't have a building. And so it used a repurposed colonial building that had been constructed in 1865 to be the town hall of Karachi, which was at that point the capital of Pakistan. Islamabad was built in the 1960s, and so the interim capital was in Pakistan's biggest city, Karachi. In Karachi's former town hall, now converted into the National Museum of Pakistan, there were hardly any artifacts in the building. There was a sprinkling of objects from South Asia's oldest civilization, the Indus Valley civilization. There was a handful of ancient Buddhist sculptures. There were a few Qurans. There was a small collection of coins. And in fact, the most imposing exhibits in the building were decorative architectural elements like entire wooden screens for windows or portions of carved facades from old homes. And those who knew about the journey of these objects to the museum would have had a very somber reminder of the link between ruination and museumization. Because according to the founder of the museum, all of these architectural elements had been picked out of, and I'm quoting here, the blackened ruins of Lahore, where flame and murder had penetrated into the old city during the partition riots. So these objects were actually picked up from smoldering ruins of houses that had been destroyed in the riots, and as the museum founder says, were now set up jauntily in the new museum. India too, for its hurriedly set up National Museum, also had to take recourse to a colonial building that it repurposed. But this was a far grander edifice than the hall in Karachi, because India used the erstwhile palace of the Viceroy, which was now the official residence of the Indian head of state, who at that time was our first Indian Governor General called C. Rajagopalachari. Here in this great building, some of the most stately rooms on the ground floor, including the great Darbar Hall, which was under the central rotunda that you see here, and the drawing rooms, were given over to a circuit of galleries of art. And as you can see through the labels that I've put in this floor plan of the lower floor of this building, this set of galleries actually bears out the Indian Education Secretary's observation that we have a much larger number of exhibits than the government of Pakistan, because you can see that there's quite a sweep of objects, materials, and periods that is presented here. How did it come about that India had this much larger number of exhibits than the government of Pakistan had it at its disposal? And how is it that we came about having this much larger number of exhibits, including a much larger number of objects from the Indus Valley sites that now belong to Pakistan? As you may know, in the 1920s, one of the most significant archaeological discoveries took place in the Indian subcontinent, where an accidental discovery was made of some buried cities that turned out to be the oldest civilization in this territory, which had been completely forgotten and was suddenly rediscovered. And this suddenly pushed back the history of South Asia by 2,000 years. This was the Indus Valley civilization, but at the time of independence, all of the major sites of that civilization fell to the Pakistani side of the border, and the objects from these sites had been placed in museums that were either at the sites or at the major Pakistani cities of Lahore and Karachi. So how is it that we came to have a particularly large and impressive collection of Indus Valley sites, which we could put on display in the government house in this inaugural exhibition of our National Museum? If we look at this display case of Indus Valley pottery in a glass case in the government house, and we try to understand how it got here to this corridor of the Indian head of state's residence, and was put inside this exhibit case, we see that there are three historical lines that actually intersect to put these objects in this case in this room. One of these historical lines actually relates to a long history of attempts to establish a museum in Delhi. A second historical line relates to an exhibition in London. And the third historical line relates to the way in which collections were shared between India and Pakistan. And I'm going to, in the next few minutes, try to very quickly sketch these out for you. Now, for most of its history, the British Raj, or the colonial government of India, had had its capital at Calcutta, which you see marked with the red dot towards the east of the subcontinent. When the British Raj decided early in the 20th century to transfer its capital to Delhi, which is the more westerly of these red dots, it had to leave behind the very grand imperial museum that it had built in Calcutta. In the years that New Delhi was being built, there was talk on and off of making a suitably impressive set of museums in the new capital of empire. And the architect and planner of the new imperial capital, an architect called Edwin Lutyens, had even included a set of museums in his complex for the central vista, which would have the Viceroy's palace and the main buildings of the government's offices. At the midpoint between the Viceroy's palace and the war memorial that stood at the end of a ceremonial path, which I think you see better in this photograph. So can you see my mouse pointer? So this is the Viceroy's palace. These were North Block and South Block, which was supposed to be the major bureaucratic offices. This was the grand ceremonial pathway, and this was a memorial arch to fallen soldiers, loyal Indians who had fallen fighting for various British causes in World War I. So at the center of this ceremonial pathway, there was a crossroads, which you see here. This map is just showing you a detail of the whole ceremonial vista. And at this crossroads, where two major avenues met, Edwin Lutyens had planned for a knowledge complex at its heart. There was a plan for a record office or an archives, a center that is marked as medical research. It's slightly obscure what that might be. There is a place that's marked out as an ethnological museum. And then there is a place that is marked out sometimes in the documents as a central imperial museum, sometimes as a central archaeological museum, and sometimes as a central national museum. But obviously this was meant to be Delhi's substitute of the grand museum that had been left behind in Calcutta. However, while New Delhi was being built by the British, the making of museums was not a high priority. And it was only in 1944 that after the end of World War II, that a committee was actually set up to press forward with museum plans. And the person who was the most important archaeologist in India, the Director General of Archaeology, he was put in charge of developing the concept, and he immediately ordered all the archaeological museums all over India to send material from their collections to Delhi so that he could make a choice of what he would like to retain for the Central National Museum. And this included a large number of artifacts from the museums that held objects in the territories to the west of the subcontinent, which would become Pakistan. And so this included a lot of material from Indus Valley sites. There were 12,000 artifacts that came from the site museums of Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, as well as from Karachi and Lahore. And there were many Gandharan sculptures and coins which came from the Taxila Museum. Then, as this material was brought to Delhi, and as the Director General of Archaeology planned to select some of them for the museum that he was going to set up, other events overtook the project. And these artifacts remained stored in boxes for a number of years in Delhi. So that's the first line of the story I wanted to trace for you, which tells you why these objects got to Delhi at all. But my scene shifts now to London, where just 3 months after India's independence, the Royal Academy mounted an ambitious exhibition titled The Arts of India and Pakistan. The mounting of such an expansive and such an expensive exhibition in 1947 has been seen by many historians as a timely gesture on the part of the British, a kind of a gracious celebration, a coming out party for these new countries, as it were, a celebration of the independence of India, of the creation of Pakistan. And the fact that this exhibition of the art of these two new nations was housed in the Royal Academy, which was a very prestigious, but also a very conservative and a very Eurocentric institution, has been construed as the kind of ultimate acknowledgement on the part of the former imperial masters that these former colonies actually have a deep level of civilization, and indeed they are worthy of being nations and not merely should be seen as former colonies. This exhibition also marks the moment when the British art establishment began to first treat South Asian artifacts as though they were fine art. They started speaking of its old stone sculptures as sculptures rather than just as antiquities, suggesting that these are interesting, not just because they are old or they have historical information in them, but also because they have some kind of aesthetic quality. Similarly, they started speaking of miniatures and book illustrations from India's early modern past as beautifully finished paintings, rather than as they had previously been seen just as sources of very vivid documentary information. So there's a kind of a promotion of these artifacts into art in the pages of the catalogue of this exhibition. Actually, the exhibition's very exquisitely appropriate timing, where it opened with a flourish just 3 months after Indian independence and Pakistan's creation, and therefore the inclusion of a number of these politically correct gestures which seem to acknowledge these nations, is actually an accident of history. The exhibition was supposed to open much earlier, but this is a history I'm not going to track in any kind of detail today. But the government of Britain recognized that this exhibition, if it was done well, could help Britain to maintain good relations with its former colonies. But if it was done badly, it would create a scandal. And therefore, it pressed all of its official machinery, both in the government of Britain in Britain and the British government in India, and they used their infrastructure to mount an enormous exhibition, which had more than 1,300 artifacts, which were gathered from museums in Britain and in India, and from many private collections as well. This show is still considered a landmark by South Asianists, and it included some monumentally large pieces of stone sculpture that have never been able to travel before or since this exhibition. Now, despite all the efforts that were made by all the institutions that were involved in putting this exhibition together and all the scholars who wrote about it, the exhibition had a very moderate success in London. People were not really enthused by it over there, but the afterlife in India was to have a huge significance, because when 239 crates that held these objects that had been borrowed from India came to a dock in Bombay, the Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, declared that it would be a real pity to disperse this exhibition without first showing it to an Indian public. And so he summoned all of these crates to Delhi, but where were we to show them? The British had very recently built their capital. There was no museum building ready. And therefore, the Minister of Education, who at that time was Maulana Azad, who had to organize this exhibition, looked around for a site for it, and he set his sights on the grandest building in Delhi, the former palace of the British Viceroy that you see in the foreground here. It was now renamed Government House. It was the official residence of the first Indian head of state. But as the very scholarly Minister of Education says in this passage from his memoirs, which I really like, he says, just like a fire worshipper, when he sees the Kaaba, in the Mecca, the most holy of holy places for Islam. So just as the fire worshipper who sees the Kaaba and says, it's so beautiful, it should have been a fire temple. Whenever I see the splendid hall of the government house, the thought that comes to my mind is, what a wonderful library or museum it would make. So Azad approached the Governor General, the head of state, and asked if he could use his residence to house the exhibition, and the Governor General agreed. He lent his residence to the cause of art and education, and in the winter of 1948, the objects that returned to India were mounted as an exhibition of Indian art that welcomed the Indian public into all of the state rooms in the lower floor of this very grand building, with sculptures displayed in the forecourt, in the veranda, and the artifacts filling the vestibule, the drawing rooms, and the grand Darbar Hall, or the hall of formal audience. The accompanying brochure makes very great claims for this exhibition, which it says shows no less than 5,000 years of Indian art. And it says that this exhibition will achieve a lot. It says it'll undo the unjust neglect that Indian art has suffered so far. And it'll unfold a world of radiant beauty that will record the Indian people's emotional and spiritual experiences for all to see. So the exhibition actually becomes an embodiment of the spirit of the Indian people. Now, the scholar Tapati Guha Thakurta has done a very careful analysis of this exhibition that opened in Delhi in 1949. And she's pointed out to a number of differences between the version that opened in Delhi and the version that had been on show in London. The London exhibition had wanted to show that Indian creativity was not a thing of the past. And therefore, it took care to include a number of contemporary Indian artists like Ratin Maitra, Jamini Rai, as well as colonial period paintings to show the long entanglements of Britain and India. It had also given pride of place to the Greek-influenced sculptures of the Gandharan region, because these were Buddhist sculptures that were in a Hellenistic mold, which appealed very easily to Western tastes. In contrast, the Delhi exhibition focused entirely on the pre-modern era. So it entirely eliminated the contemporary Indian artists as well as the artists of the colonial period. And it also marginalized the Gandharan material by relegating it to a corridor, while the so-called indigenous art of the Gupta period, which followed shortly after, was given pride of place. Clearly, the exhibition that was mounted in the newly independent territory of India wanted to frame a primordial India that was uncontaminated by any kind of external influence, whether it was Hellenistic, whether it was Islamic, or whether it was colonial. And this, I'm afraid, is an attitude that underlies the National Museum's displays till this day. Now, the presence of this exhibition of Indian art in the Viceroy's former palace gave people of all classes the opportunity to enter a building that they could never have approached in colonial times. And by their very act of ascending the stairs and entering its resounding halls, the exhibition's audience performatively demonstrated the Indian people's newly won democratic rights and their successful displacement of colonial power. Once they were inside, the art that they saw in these rooms and corridors of the great palace were presented to them as their own achievement, because according to the curators, the art of India presents a visual proof of the creative activity, the aesthetic achievement, and the emotional outlook of the Indian people. The exhibition made its most theatrical gesture of decoloniality in the Grand Darbar Hall. Here, on the curtained and swagged platform that had formerly supported the thrones of the Viceroy and the Viceroy, there now stood a larger-than-life style Buddha figure from the Gupta period. Smiling gently, with his monk's robes falling in soft folds across his body, his hand now broken, but originally raised in a gesture that told worshippers to have no fear. The Buddha stood as an emblem of the spiritually rich people of India who had successfully but non-violently ejected the viceroy from his throne. The history of how an exhibition of art mounted in London came to occupy the halls of the erstwhile Viceroy's Palace in Delhi is the second of those three lines that I had wanted to trace that explains the presence of this case of Indus Valley artifacts in the hallowed halls of the Viceroy's Palace. But what was on show in Delhi had not come from London by a simple return journey. Because after all, the things that had left India had left one British territory of India, but now they had to return to two nations of India and Pakistan. And there were conflicting claims over the ownership of several artifacts when the exhibition in London came to an end and had to be packed up and things had to be returned home. There were questions about what was the home for particular objects. These debates actually constitute the third line of history that I want to trace that converges to bring these objects here. Oops. What we see in this famous photograph, which is probably staged, is a photograph of a librarian at the Parliament Library trying to partition books between the libraries of the newly partitioned nations. But the process that we are seeing staged over here for us had to be undergone by many museum collections as well. And there were many committees that were formed that tried to decide what that lay in museums should go to India and what should go to Pakistan. And in these committees, what was most bitterly contested were a cache of Indus Valley artifacts that were being claimed by both countries. I've already mentioned how the accidental discovery in the 1920s of the Indus Valley civilization had served to extend India's history by a stunning 2,000 years. Suddenly, the region could boast of civilizational achievements that were contemporary with ancient Mesopotamia. Being able to claim such an ancient past was important for both India and Pakistan. And at the time of Indian independence, all the known sites of this civilization happened to fall on the Pakistani side of the border. But as we recall, huge numbers of Indus Valley artifacts had been brought from museums in these Pakistani sites to Delhi so that the museum founders could make a selection of objects for the proposed imperial museum that the British never built. So too, there were many Gandharan objects from Taxila, which had also been in storage in Delhi for many years. Objects from this cache of things that had been stored in Delhi had traveled to London, but where were they to return? India staked its claim on all of them based on a bureaucratic arrangement that had been made that things would be shipped back to where they had come from. Pakistan refused to take back any of its exhibits from London unless it got all the objects that it held to be its own. So as studies by scholars like Nayanjot Lahiri and Sudeshna Guha and Himanshu Ray have shown, there were very bitter negotiations, particularly over the Indus Valley objects that both sides wanted. And eventually a committee which was composed of archaeologists from both sides, had to sit across a table in London and had to divide the spoils, sometimes literally tossing a coin to see who would get what. There was particular wrangling over two figural sculptures from the Indus Valley sites, one of a bearded male, christened the Priest King by archaeologists, and one of a naked girl, which was labeled the Dancing Girl, though there's no real evidence to call either of these figures by these fictitious names. And although Pakistan protested that it had to give up the bronze female figure to India, Later, a minister from Pakistan was to say that it's only in the fitness of things that the lascivious Hindus would want the naked dancing girls, while for the pious Muslims of Pakistan, a devout and decently dressed male was really the appropriate choice. Less palatable, perhaps, was the fate of a necklace made of gold and semi-precious stones that, as Naranjot Lahiri recounts, was divided bead by bead between the two countries. So you see the necklace as discovered in the center in the black and white photograph, and you see the divided necklace being held by the two respective national museums. It should be noted that India gave all of its Gandharan sculptures to Taxila without a fuss, because the phase of Buddhist art that looked Hellenistic was not important to the cultural identity that India was forming for itself. But Indus Valley civilization, lying at the primordial beginnings of India's history, was very important, and it was worth fighting over objects that attested to that civilization. Now, the Pakistani archaeologist, or the archaeologist on the Pakistani side rather, who was fighting to bring Indus Valley objects to Pakistan, complained that when coins were tossed, India won the toss every time. The irony is that this man who was fighting to take things back to Pakistan was the same man who had ordered all of these Indus Valley objects to be brought to Delhi in the first place. And that's what led to India having a claim over these objects in the arrangements of the partition councils. And this person was Mortimer Wheeler, an important and eminent British archaeologist who had been brought in by the colonial government of India to be the last British Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India in 1944. He was a great popularizer of archaeology, and he began immediately to embark on a project of a grand museum for Delhi, for which he amassed all these collections in Delhi. But immediately after independence, when Wheeler's term in India was over, the government of Pakistan asked Wheeler to be their special archaeological advisor, and he set about making a national museum there. It is he who wrote that sardonic comment that I had quoted earlier about the founding of the National Museum of Pakistan. And he must have really smarted when he was sitting on the Pakistani side of the table, seeing the loss of so many of Pakistan's antiquities to India as a result of his own prior decisions when he was on the Indian side. When Wheeler got the government of Pakistan to immediately set up a national museum for Pakistan, the government of India, as we have seen, did not want to be left behind, and it announced that it too would set up a national museum. And in fact, it said that it had already set up a national museum. The temporary exhibition that was there at Government House in New Delhi, they said was going to go on indefinitely. And the collection that was on show in that exhibition of Indian art was going to be the kernel of the new National Museum for the new nation that had just been formed. The problem was that the National Museum had no legal claim over any of the objects that it wanted to keep. All the objects in that exhibition had come from some other repository. It had either come from other museums or from private collections. And when Prime Minister Nehru put out appeals to the lenders to the exhibition, which included provincial museums, public museums, private collectors, and particularly the rulers of the former princely states in India, when Prime Minister Nehru asked them to contribute their collections to the national clause, practically all of the collectors refused. The private collectors were distraught at the thought of losing their art treasures, and they demanded them back immediately. The rulers of the princely states, whom we call popularly the Maharajas of India, they were even less sympathetic. These were descendants of India's traditional dynasties who, under British rule, had some small degree of autonomy and authority, but after independence had been arm twisted into giving even that up and joining the Indian nations. And their disaffection towards the center, which had robbed them of their power and so much of their wealth, was quite understandable. But even government museums from cities like Madras or Calcutta or Bombay, or from smaller towns like Mathura or Patna, they all demanded their artifacts to be returned. Nobody seemed to be wanting to be co-opted into this national project. The government actually hurriedly consulted some legal sources and asked whether they had eminent domain of these artifacts, whether they could hold on to any of them by fiat. And it turned out that they couldn't. And in the end, getting things out of Pakistan became easier than getting them out of other collections in India. In the years that followed, the government very grudgingly returned these collections to their various owners. And since the Director General of the National Museum was also the Director General of the Archaeological Survey, the National Museum received artifacts from the collections of archaeological museums in his charge. But it was also forced into the ignominy of appealing to private collectors for gifts, as well as of purchasing objects to make a national museum worthy of its name, because nobody was willingly contributing. There are some amusing stories I found in the archives about the government's attempts to acquire collections for the National Museum. I thought I'd share a few vignettes with you today. For example, many of the princely states had very valuable collections, and it was really hard to get them to part with them. When the Maharaja of Jaipur, whom we see here, was asked to offer his collections for the national cause, he turned the national imperative on its head, and he very disingenuously wrote that the petty little things that he had were hardly of any national importance. They weren't really good works of art at all. They had a bit of sentimental value for the people of Jaipur, but they were only of regional significance. They're not worthy of being in the National Museum, and therefore they should be returned to him. Did the nation state of India, did its government have any kind of legal claim over the art treasures held by these princely states? It was determined that if these had belonged to the state, then perhaps some kind of control could be exercised by the government of India, because then they would have been passed over into union property. But it was often not at all clear what in these princely states was state property and that India could claim, and what was private property held by the rulers in their individual capacity, which they could retain. And any attempts to make inventories, these were resisted. So, for example, the Maharaja of Bharatpur had a collection of 2,000 very rare gold coins from the 5th century that had been discovered buried in the grounds that he possessed. The government was very keen to get hold of these for the National Museum. The Maharaja was very keen not to give them up. He refused to clarify ownership. Had these been entered as property of a trust? Were they his personal possessions? He wouldn't show any papers. He wouldn't answer any questions. After a lot of wheedling, he agreed to give a representative sample of coins to the museum. And when he agreed to that, then the government many times arranged to send experts to make a selection of these coins. And each time the Maharaja evaded them. The archive tracks all of his evasions and his tantrums, where he's trying to leave town to avoid meeting the museum officials, or he goes back on his word after promising the gift of a particular coin, and then he becomes incensed at the suggestion that he might have dissembled about wanting to give that coin. Eventually, the museum was grudgingly given about 200 coins out of his collection of nearly 2,000. As I looked through the archive and I read tale after tale of recalcitrant owners who were unwilling to give their collections to the National Museum, I was very surprised to find that one Maharaja very eagerly offered to give his collection of valuable manuscripts to the national cause. This was the Maharaja of Kapoor, Thala, whom we are seeing on the left over here. And he very cordially invited the National Museum staff to come to Kapoor, Thala to make the selection of whatever they wanted from all the manuscripts that he owned. A representative from the museum went to Kapoor, Thala. He was drawing up lists of what he would like to bring back to Delhi when the door burst open and a man came from the neighboring state of Patiala. And it turned out that he said that the manuscripts no longer belonged to the Maharaja of Kapoor, Thala, so they were not his to give. They had been taken over by a newly formed administrative unit of Indian Punjab, in which the former princely state of Patiala, which had always been Kapoor, Thala's rival, now held the dominant role. And so it was these rivalries that made the Maharaja of Kapoor, Thala want to give his treasures to Delhi rather than give it to his old rival right next door in Patiala. But the National Museum was stymied because it turned out that Patiala actually held the rights to hold these manuscripts for themselves because they were state property that had passed into the union that they now control. So these things remained in Patiala. The museum actually succeeded in buying some private collections. It acquired a huge collection of ancient bronze sculptures and about 2,000 miniature paintings that had been put together by a Parsi lawyer from Bombay who was called Burjo Treasury Wala. When the colonial government had started planning a central national museum for Delhi, scholars who had seen the Treasury Wala collection already said that this would be a great collection to acquire, and some discussion about acquisition had already begun. And then Treasury Wala died suddenly in 1947. So when he died, the museum authorities had the presence of mind to rush to Bombay and persuade his widow not to sell the collection bit by bit, but to keep it for the museum. She agreed to sell it to the National Museum, but she had to wait for 12 years before she was paid half of the price that she was asked. So it's these kinds of bureaucratic delays and bargainings and budget constraints, which also often affect the capacity of the museum to build a collection. Eventually, the Treasury Wala collection formed the core of the museum's miniature painting and bronze sculpture collection, both of which are just fabulous. As this collection was being built up, the museum continued to function from the Governor General's residence. But the Governor General's staff was often in contestation with the museum, as both wanted more and better spaces in the building. The Governor General's staff wanted its major reception rooms back so that they could hold state functions there. The museum wanted room for its growing collections and for other activities that the museum had to perform, including its conservation laboratory. Now, some years ago, I was able to order copies of a lot of photographs from the photographic archive of the National Museum. And what I'm showing you is from that archive, but there's no information there apart from the year when the photograph was taken. And so though I don't have a textual record to accompany what exactly we are seeing here, one can intuit something about the functioning of the institution in these years of the 1950s. And you can see that the museum seems to have been an active place. This photograph shows an artist making an excellent version of one of the museum's ancient sculptures. It dates to 1955 or 1956. And perhaps this workshop demonstration was held to celebrate the arrival of the bronze sculptures from the Treasury Wala collection. One frequently also sees pictures like this, which show us very engaged audiences within the museum. This clearly is, I mean, to my eyes, is clearly a middle class audience. And then this, to my eyes, is a working class audience. And you see large numbers of animated and enthused publics in the museum. The museum also seems to have had an active outreach department that took displays of photographs of Indian art to nearby villages. And I find these photographs that I'm about to show you of an exhibition that was held in probably a school, a very ragged looking government school in some kind of a rural setting near Delhi. I find them very touching because there is a kind of earnest idealism about the enterprise that you don't often get to see. But as you look at photographs from the museum's own galleries in the 1950s, as it continued to function from Government House, over time, you notice that the backgrounds change. You no longer see the exhibits occupying very grand halls with marble and archway. The museum seems to have been relegated to lesser premises within the president's estate. It had clearly outstayed its welcome. But the museum authorities also knew that the presidential palace could not be their permanent home. And so they had been making efforts to acquire a suitable site for the museum. In 1952, the famous French architect Le Corbusier, who used to visit India frequently in connection with the building of the city Chandigarh that he made here, Le Corbusier was asked if he would like to design the National Museum, and he accepted. I haven't been able to understand from archival documents why this went no further, though there is a hint about the expense it would entail. And there is also a hint about how a foreigner is not quite the right person to make a building that really should have been in conformity with Indian traditions. And so in the end, the design of the building was taken up by architects of India's bureaucratic architectural apparatus, the Central Public Works Division, which makes government offices. And the first Indian architect to head it, someone called Deolalikar, is identified as the architect and the planner of the National Museum. We are seeing the then President of India unveiling the model of the museum building. This is the museum building as proposed by Deolalikar. And this aerial shot of the museum building below that we see today shows us that actually only a fraction of a modified version of the building was made. The octagon that the building was supposed to be was never actually completed. There must have been some exigencies to do with budgets that didn't allow the whole museum to come up at the time. But as it was being built, the scholar Christy Phillips has noted that the files in the archive say that no expense is to be spared. The best quality of marble, the best quality teak is to be used over here. And this is quite different from the other government offices that were being made with great economy at the time, because the National Museum was meant to be a showpiece which would be visited by tourists, by Indian citizens, and by foreign dignitaries. So it had to be a monument to Indian pride. Now, as this building neared completion in 1960, the Education Ministry began to look for a suitable director for this new museum. If we look at the museum journal that was published by the Consortium of Museum Keepers in India, we see that in the 1950s and in the 1960s, the museum journal is filled with articles about the role of museums in mass education, the way museums, as places that display visual media, can help to impart some messages to illiterate publics, and India has such a large unlettered public. So the idea that the museum could serve as an educational tool that could speak directly to an unlettered people had really taken hold in the minds of the powers that be. And Prime Minister Nehru said, I want someone to direct this museum who is totally up to date with the international trends in museology. I don't want it in the hands of the traditional archaeologists who have been running it up to now. He wanted an expert who would make good of the promise that museums can communicate with all levels of society. After an international search, the director they found who matched this philosophy of museums turned out to be an American woman. This was Grace Morley. She was an American museologist who for 25 years had been the director of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. She was at that time then, after leaving San Francisco, working for ICOM in Rome. And Morley agreed to come to India on Nehru's behest to set up the National Museum in its new home in 1960. She was given a contract period of 3 years when she was to lead the museum and train the staff that would succeed her. As the former director of a museum of modern art, Morley was the votary of the white cube. She favored a pared down display style that was minimalist and that gave focus to the artworks alone. This was a big change from the earlier forms of display. While the technique of display might have been brought in by Morley, the content of what she displayed came to her from her Indian colleagues through the narrative that they provided, the story that unfolded in the National Museum's new galleries, retold a nationalistic art history in which a great continuous tradition is traced through a circuit of galleries that starts with the Indus Valley civilization and then goes on a long unbroken trajectory from the Buddhist sculpture of the early Common Era to the later Hindu temple sculpture that flourished after Buddhism declined and that held center stage till about the 13th century. So this sculptural chronological sweep that the galleries defined ended in a flourish with the display of these bronze sculptures from the 10th to the 13th centuries. In the way that it arranged its sculptures, the National Museum foregrounded the evolution of style from one figure to the next. And this was an interesting strategy because it had the effect of suggesting that works that were made in different places at different times in service of different religious affiliations were all united in a common purpose of achieving the perfect form. So images that were sponsored by Buddhists or Jains or Vaishnavas or Shaiva communities, they all become united in a single impulse or evolution. Such an interpretation, of course, becomes an enactment in the cultural sphere of the urgent need that was felt at the time to unite a disparate country like India. And it demonstrates the national motto of unity in diversity, which was really the mantra of Nehru's times. Now, the series of galleries relating to sculpture are arranged chronologically. They take us from the Indus Valley, from proto-history, through early Buddhist sculpture to the classical medieval sculptures. However, the chronological frame extends only to these galleries. Made of enduring metal and stone, you can say that these artifacts are very useful for tracing a long history, for demonstrating a continued and a connected history. But all the other galleries, which dealt with later or other materials, were not arranged according to chronology or historical period or dynasty. Instead, they were all arranged according to material. So there's a gallery for textiles, there's a gallery for metalwork, there's a gallery for painting on paper, and so on and so forth. And all of these are actually relegated to the upper floors of the museum, which are less popularly visited. Now, whether it is intended or not, this kind of display has the effect of lifting everything that was made after the 12th century out of a track of history and into a discourse on technique and skills, where when you see a sash that might have been worn by, let's say, a Mughal emperor, you see it as an example of an embroidery or a weaving technique. Or when you see a sword or a piece of armor that might have been worn by a Sultanate ruler, you see it as an example of damascening or of inlay. And so whether it's intended or not, this kind of display actually lifts all of these objects out of history into a discourse on techniques and skills. And because Islam established itself in India only in the 12th century onwards, the effect that this arrangement has is a marginalization of the Islamic arts of India. It's a curatorial arrangement that takes Islamic objects out of the context of history, takes them out of the context of a cultural grouping, and puts them in a history of skill. The result is that one can walk right through the National Museum and be only dimly aware of the fact that there had been, let's say, a Mughal dynasty in India. For those of us who have grown up visiting the museum in Delhi, it's very hard for us to square the very spare, minimal elegance of Grace Morley's galleries with the more lurid and more poorly tended spaces that we have seen in recent years. The museum has received its share of criticism from international bodies like UNESCO, as well as India's own Auditor General. And yet, despite its many, many dysfunctionalities, the idea that even what stands today is facing erasure and radical reorientation causes a lot of misgivings. The museum's displays have already downplayed the history of Muslim dynasties or of Islam as part of Indian heritage. In the future, one wonders if they will have any place at all. Remember, the attempts to revise history that are ongoing, which I referred to early in the lecture. The new and updated displays in the museum that somebody recently sent me, these are not open yet, so this is like a sneak peek. They are kind of bizarre, where you're seeing a medieval artifact in a gallery and projected onto the case is a kind of an audio visual, which in Hindi gives us a bizarre mythologization where the projection has this pot shown, and we are told that this is the pot that the gods churned and got the nectar of immortality from. And then it says something about the flowers that the woman is holding, though there is absolutely no connection between what is shown in the video and what, so luridly shown in the video with that horrible graphic and the sculpture itself, which is of fine quality. So it makes me wonder, is this what's in store when the current National Museum is demolished and a new display is put in place? I console myself sometimes by saying that narratives can be written, unwritten, and rewritten. But I also do worry about the future of the collection, which now consists of some 200,000 objects, whose cataloging remains incomplete, which is not photographed even in its entirety, whose inventories are not available to the public to peruse. Though we are told that there is a plan to build a high-tech facility to store the objects from the museum, there is no transparency about how this is going to be done and what kind of experts will be used for this. The tender document that was just floated to get people to express interest in this project gave people a period of, I think, 12 days to respond to the expression of interest. It was not circulated internationally. So I have no idea what kind of parties are going to bid for this and have the opportunity to build this supposedly high-tech storage center for the very, very valuable and undocumented artifacts that the museum holds. And so I fear that how much of what has been amassed will survive this move. But that, I'm afraid, belongs to a future that I cannot today foretell. So on this somewhat gloomy note, let me end, and I'll be happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, Kavita Singh, for that fascinating talk. This actually dovetails a lot with the class that I run for the museum on museum studies, and all of our students intern with us. We just had a whole discussion about the different missions of museums and monuments because of the Confederate monuments that we've had in Virginia and the removal and this kind of retelling of history. And what do monuments really do? What do museums really do? Do you feel like the mission of the museum going forward is going to change under the new regime from what it had been? Do you feel like that the mission has changed over time?
So there are some kind of disconnections already within the different kinds of purposes that the museum has tried to serve, where an idea of a purely art museum, which I think derives from a French classical model, was adopted at the outset into a context which really wanted a cultural museum or a historical museum. And so to try and force a set of decontextualized and artified objects and to try and make them then tell a story about a context that you're not actually invoking through your displays has been one of the confusions, that confound this institution and its ability to communicate. It's sort of like neither flesh nor fowl. What is going to happen, I think it's quite clear to us what is likely to happen. We have been told by the architect, who is the only one who's putting out any kind of statements. The government itself is not telling us much about what they have planned, but the architect says that the museum is going to be packed up and it's going to shift to those two big colonial period office block buildings, which will no longer serve as office blocks. However, one wing is going to be an exhibit of the making of India, and the other wing is going to be India at 75, because all of this is supposed to happen by the 75th anniversary of independence. Mm-hmm. Now, the making of India, we're not clear what that will have, but India, we know, is going to be a particular monolithic India, which excludes all external influences, including Islam. And you can be pretty sure that the objects that are going to be chosen to be put in this narrative are going to be used to tell a story that is rather different from the story that I've read about in books. Mm-hmm. There is a huge investment on the popular level in India about correcting history. It's everything to do with the history of medieval India is seen as part of a huge conspiracy that historians have had against Hindutva all of these years, and it has to be corrected. And so, of course, this new institution is going to be an opportunity for that. What I also, I was resigned to that, I'm afraid, but what I also shudder to think of is the aesthetic quality. If that little clip I showed at the end is any indication of the kind of design ideas they're coming up with for their new displays, and if they think that projecting moving images onto a sculpture is some way of being up to date, I shudder to think what lies ahead.
As if it's implying like the object can't stand on its own as something worthy of, that it has to have all kinds of tech projected on it, as if that it somehow enhances and gives it something it didn't already have. Well, we have some questions lining up for you. Jane Davis asks, so appreciate your concentration on the location of the Indus Valley artifacts. I visited Mohenjo-Daro some 25 years ago and was so impressed with the civilization. My question was going to be to ask about the effects of partition on the dispersal of the artifacts from the valley. Little did I know you would make a centerpiece of your talk, an important focus. Thank you so much for your research and illumination. And Suzanne Chitwood also thanks you for a wonderful talk. Professor Sarah Betzer from the Art History Department asked, I find the discussion of the sculpture gallery as the exclusive venue for historicity fascinating. Did this museological framing engage with a parallel textual art historical account that puts similar pressure on sculpture as the privileged medium for questions of stylistic development over time?
Oh, yes, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And even in these periods belonging to the ancient past, even though material from softer, artifacts of softer material are well known. So from very early in the development of the history of Indian art, we have known that there is material in terracotta or ivory or bone. Even today, these are not put side by side with the stone sculptures from the same era, though they can affect the narrative. They can bring new new deities, new sects. They can tell us things about new, other practices beyond what the canonized stone sculptures tell us. But there is still this obsession with just the granite and the bronze. And it skews the telling of our stories entirely in favor of what is, large as it is actually a sliver of what must have been. So you're absolutely right. The pressure that is placed on these sculptures is tremendous. I also feel that in the teens of the 20th century, so, in the, first 2 decades of the 20th century, when you had people like E.B. Havel and Ananda Kumar Swamy beginning to form an art history for Indian art, where they were trying to argue for for a canon of Indian art, which should be appreciated through an aesthetic standard that is its own, not by a Western standard by which it would be found wanting. However decolonial their attempts may have been, they were also profoundly underwritten by certain colonial frameworks. So if you understand that high art elsewhere has been stone sculpture from the ancient period, you look immediately for an analogous manifestation here, which is stone sculpture from the ancient period. So you have your Greek and Roman stuff, we have our Kushana and Gupta stuff. Similarly, if you had painting from the Renaissance as one of the key genres, then we have 15th century painting, we have 16th century painting in our manuscripts, right? So though we take for granted, because it's part of our habitus, we take for granted that, of course, stone sculptures are important in the history of Indian art. Of course, manuscript illustration is important in the history of Indian art. If you actually think about what could have been alternative ways of formation of genres, you realize that at that formative moment in Indian art history, people were not actually thinking as freely. I mean, for me, the counter example for this would be to look at the way people have written about the arts of Japan, or how a canon of Japanese art history has been formed, where you have lacquer work, and you have textiles, which centrally form important and respected genres that fall into the history of art. And India, as this amazing producer of textiles through history, doesn't look at textiles as a part of its art history. So there is some kind of a blinkered vision that actually produced these genres for us.
Do you think they were very self-conscious and it was outward looking rather than inward looking?
Yes, so to give, and to give them their credit, you have to think of what art history was 100 years ago, and it was a nascent, very just being formed kind of discipline, and it's quite natural to borrow categories, to play this game of equivalence, like you have that, we have that too. It's quite a natural thing to imagine at that time, but we have traveled a long distance. We should be we should have shed some of those preoccupations a long time ago.
Yeah. Jane Davis, I'm going to skip to her question just because it relates to exactly what you just said. She says, of course, Islam did not have a figure of tradition, so that immediately eliminates it from the sculpture gallery, although Buddhist footprints from early representations are often shown. So she's saying, if you're going to focus on Hinduism, maybe this is a perfect way of furthering that. Our director, Matthew McClendon, says, thank you, Professor Singh, for a completely fascinating lecture. I'm curious, is the Modi government mobilizing contemporary art and artists in service to its correcting of history, as you've detailed in your illustrations of exhibition practices in the National Museum displays of ancient and historic artifacts?
That's a really interesting question. And my immediate response to that is no, I think not. And then if that is my immediate response, then I have to ask, why not? There will, of course, be a lot of artists who would be fellow travelers, and they will get some amount of patronage. They'll get a few projects, they'll get, they will benefit from their closeness to the government, which happens in every regime and with every ideological shift. But I think the critical thing in the contemporary art world is that power and opportunities are much more dispersed. They are more globalized, because in India, where our museum sector is really rather underdeveloped, and we also have a particularly underdeveloped system of public institutions for modern and contemporary art. The infrastructure is physically larger for pre-modern art, but modern and contemporary art, the government hasn't really dipped its toes in those waters very much. A lot of the support for contemporary art actually comes from institutions allied with the art market. So it would be art galleries which actually perform a quasi-museum function. They have retrospectives, they publish books, they sponsor research, whatever you may have to say about market-driven research, but they do sponsor research. And I think because of that, the kind of taste making and the interpretation and the markets or audiences are more variegated and are less easy to control.
And I wonder if they're at all concerned or a little shy of contemporary artists who are typically in other countries the first to kind of push the envelope. And I'm wondering if they're worried about having their Ai Weiwei moment. The way China.
Yes, I don't see a figure quite like him on our landscape, but I think that these are guys who are best left alone. So they are, they just flourish in their own patch.
The old stuff's better. We'll just no,
because you can make it say anything you want to make it say.
Right. The artist can't talk back.
Yeah.
So Dan Enbaum says, great talk as always. Thank you, Kavita, so much. And Sarah Besser, thanks you so much for answering her question. It's fantastic. So that appears to be it. So we want to thank you so much for a fabulous talk that's very much in sync with all the things we've been discussing in our classes and the telling of history and the contemporary ramifications of that. Oh, we have one more question that just popped up. Krista Gulbranson says, thank you so much for a fascinating talk. My question is about the photograph of the Darbar Gallery and the Rashtrapati Bhavan. I am curious about the selection of objects there. You highlighted the Gupta Buddha at the center of the display, but I'm wondering about the objects that surround it. These were a bit hard to see in the photograph, but it looked to me like they were largely Chola bronzes, including a few Shiva Nataraja. Do you know why these objects were chosen to surround the Buddha?
Krista, thanks a lot for the question, and thanks for being there, and thanks Dan also for being there today. So sharp eye, thanks for asking that. In fact, that picture in which I was able to show the Buddha most clearly is not a picture from the 1949 iteration of the exhibition when the National Museum first was instituted in Government House or Rashtrapati Bhavan. There was a slightly hazy picture. I can email both of these to you so you can see them better. There was a slightly hazy picture earlier in my presentation, which shows some material you will recognize. So the Buddha that was on the podium or the throne platform, which actually remains in the Rashtrapati Bhavan today. The Rashtrapati Bhavan also didn't give some of the sculptures to the National Museum. So the National Museum lost a great Mauryan sculpture and a great Gupta sculpture to the Rashtrapati Bhavan when it moved out. So during the exhibition, you can see that there was a number of Kushan sculptures, including that famous pot-bellied Kuber, which is in the Kushan gallery. So you see a few sculptures like that were there in a rather spare display in that iteration. And the array of that semicircular arrangement of the Chola bronzes, which is so striking in one of the pictures I showed, is from a later moment in the 1950s. I put it in because it gave a clearer view of the room, but it's from a later moment, and I think it celebrates the arrival of the Treasury-wala collection into the museum.
Okay. And she says, I love those photos. Thank you.
I'll email them right away.
Awesome. Our director of the Fralin, Matthew McClendon, says, thank you so much for sharing your insightful research with us tonight and reminding us all why the history of museums is so worthy of study. So, and I want to thank you too. I echo that sentiment.
I'm very grateful. Thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed for having me and for being with me for so long.
Thank you so much. And we'll be looking forward to seeing and hearing more about your work in the future. All right. Thank you, everyone who attended. I want to draw your quick attention to our Weedon lecture next week, our second of the semester. We are going to welcome Masuma Farhad, the chief curator and the Ebrahimi family curator of Persian, Arab, and Turkish art at the National Museum of Asian Art, Smithsonian Institution. And she's going to be speaking on word in image, inscribed manuscript paintings in 16th century Iran. So that'll be November 18th, Thursday night at 6:30 p.m. And again, it will be on Zoom. And so the register link is on our Fralin website. So you can sign up, and that'll complete our Weedon lecture series for the fall, and we'll have 2 more in the spring. Thank you all so much for attending, and looking forward to presenting again. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kavita.